Hi, everybody. My name is Tanya Hoshi, and I'm the Chief Social Media Officer for Vevaina. Thank you so much for making time to attend today's Zoroastrian conversation session. For those of you who don't know, this is a new online interview show that's hosted by Vevaina, and it features academics from all around the world who focus their career on Zoroastrian and Iranian studies. And it also introduces the global Zoroastrian community to the most respected and up-and-coming scholars working in these fields. The show is hosted by Yuhan Zorabdinshaw Vevaina. He's the Bahari Associate Professor of Sasanian Studies and Fellow of Wolfson College at the University of Oxford. And I'm so excited to have him host today's show. So with that, please give a warm welcome to Yuhan.
Can you all hear me? Yes? Great. So, I have to say that thank you very much for the introduction, and Tanya, and I'm also very excited to be here today and to have an opportunity to chat with our speaker, Dr. Mariano Errichiello, who is a scholar of Zoroastrianism with a keen interest in the history, texts, and communities of the Zoroastrians of the modern period, modern and contemporary, I should say. So Mariano wrote his PhD at SOAS, the University of London, on the social history of esoteric Zoroastrian communities in modern India, along with a translation as well. And he has presented the findings of his research in international academic conferences in Asia, Europe, and the US, earning 2 honorable mentions by the Ancient India and Iran Trust and the Early Career Prize by the Association for the Study of Persianate Societies and the Journal of Persianate Studies. He has also recently been shortlisted for the 2023 Bailey Prize for a distinguished thesis on an Asian subject. Mariano has been a resident fellow of the Center for Comparative Studies of Civilisations and Spiritualities at Fondazione Giorgio Cini in Venice, and a research fellow of the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies at the University of Copenhagen. In 2022, he joined the Center for Advanced Studies in the Humanities and Social Sciences of the Friedrich-Alexander-Universität Erlangen-Nürnberg in Germany as a postdoctoral fellow. He's been around. So, in September of 2023, Dr. Errichiello was appointed as the Shapoorji Pallonji Lecturer of Zoroastrianism, the co-chair and executive director of the Shapoorji Pallonji Institute of Zoroastrian Studies at SOAS, and I think his co-chair, Almut Hinzer, is here as well, so we're very happy to have her. And we are so privileged to have another scholar of contemporary Zoroastrianism added to the mix to balance out the very ancient focused sort of top-heavy side of the business that I and many of our colleagues work on. So with that, let us kick off. And I should say that Mariano and I met, I think, probably in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, in London.
18 or 19.
Yeah, I think so. That sounds about right. And I've sort of followed his career pretty closely since then. And it's I'm extremely excited to be able to chat with him today about his career, his views on Zoroastrianism, and also to have him have an opportunity to speak with you all about his extremely fascinating career and life trajectory to bring him to this particular crazy field. So with that, let's get going. So Mariano, tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and how you got interested in the study of Zoroastrianism. And tell us the juicy version.
Well, first of all, hello everybody, and thank you so much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you to you, Johan and Arzan and Vevaina, for establishing this space, which is, it's very interesting to connect scholars with the community. And well, looking back at the people you have invited so far, it seems the place to formalize appointments. So it's like you are doing najot of new academics.
It is. So, I mean, it is true. In fact, I mean, so far, every person that I've been able to interview has recently acquired a very, very important position to help us develop the field.
So, well, I'm blessed to be here. Thank you so much for the invite. And well, answering your question, who am I? So I'm someone who is motivated by learning new things. And if I don't learn new things, I get bored, so I change. This has been a bit the main driver behind my life trajectory. I have lived in several countries. So I'm Italian. Was born in Naples, in Italy, where I studied international management a few years ago. And in Napoli, I joined a student organization, AIESEC. I began taking some leadership roles within this organization. And then with this organization, I went to Central America. I lived in Costa Rica and Panama for 1 year. I learned Spanish. It was a very exciting period of my life. And then I went to Mexico, up to Mexico, and took a job in business consulting in PricewaterhouseCoopers, a professional services company. My work was mainly sales, relationship management with clients, governments, and I grew in this company. I worked there in Mexico for 6 years. And was in charge of foreign clients. Then I expanded my role for Latin America, and it was, the dream job for someone who studied international management, traveling a lot. But at some point, the question of meaning came up, and learning new things. And I remembered at that time that something that always interested me since a kid was ancient history, religions, mysticism, esotericism. So I decided to, I was single, no children, no married. So I could take some risks. And I decided to explore the possibility to make this passion my interest. So I moved to London, still working in the same company, but I began a master part-time at SOAS. The master was Religions of Asia and Africa, quite broad. However, when it came the moment to decide the modules, there were a variety of options, and I was very interested in Zoroastrianism. So as an ignorant of Zoroastrianism, my first association was Nietzsche or the Magi, these stereotypes. And then I saw that it was very interesting that at that point, it was offered together with languages, Avestan, Middle Persian. So it was an opportunity to go deep into some tradition, and that's what I did. Almut Hinze was my teacher. Very happy to know that she's here. And so I did my master, and it was a fascinating experience. In my class, there were 2 Parsis, Kerman Darwalla and Yazab Bada, who is the priest here in London. So it was really, entertaining experience to see how Zoroastrianism is lived in everyday life. And after that, I took a sabbatical year. I left the job and I began a PhD. And I need to really thank Almut, who was really encouraging me to go for a PhD. And I was also the inaugural recipient of the Shapoorji Pallonji doctoral scholarship. So it's really a case of life that now I'm back. And so that also brings deepest gratitude to the Institute, and it has been made possible thanks to a donation by Shapoor Misri in 2018. So that's why I'm here, and that's how I studied Zoroastrianism.
So what aspect of Zoroastrianism do you find particularly interesting? I mean, maybe perhaps you could tell people a little bit, it's a leading question, because you can maybe tell them a little bit about what you wrote your dissertation on, because it's not a topic that necessarily is the first thing one would assume someone would work on coming from an Italian background, let's say.
Yeah, it is. So I was in a class, one of the classes of Almut, and so what she does, she assigns papers to students, and we read the papers, and the following week we discuss the papers in class. So my paper at that time was about Zoroastrianism. It was an article on an encyclopedia, I don't remember what, and there was a small section on Ilmek Shnu. So the following week I asked Almut, this is very interesting to me. I would like to know more. Can you suggest some readings? And she told me, there's not much. This could be your dissertation topic, but you need to learn Gujarati. And that's how I started. I started, learning slowly Gujarati, engaging with primary sources. Why I was interested in Ilmek Shnu, which is an esoteric interpretation of Zoroastrianism, because indeed this esoteric, and I was fascinated by this aspect. It was not much studied, a bit marginalized, and also there were some reports that they were not very happy to speak with scholars and against Western scholarship, etc. But I must say, when I went to India and I did fieldwork in a few occasions, and they have always welcomed me, and we had very long conversations about Shnum, what it is, and etc. So let's say that esotericism is a bit what modern esotericism is a bit what has triggered my interest in pursuing this career at the beginning. Then with time, obviously, my interest expanded. And in recent job in Germany, I worked on the Nirangdin ceremony, which is the consecration of water and bull's urine. So into ritual, social history, broadly understood, and also as long as one go into the study of modern religions, there are also some aspects of that need to be tackled, especially in the current understanding we have of modern Zoroastrianism. I think there's much work to do. So I find it like a huge opportunity to really do something meaningful.
Okay, so I want to jump back for a second. When you mentioned that you did field work and you did field work in India, it's, I think, worth saying that, this is something that every single scholar of Zoroastrianism who has either done field work in India or Iran or the diaspora, or they've had the opportunity to go to those places and work in the context of, let's say, archives, have had a much sort of more enriched experience. So can you perhaps tell the people here a little bit about where you did your field work, sort of, and the way that you made contacts with the people in the community? You said that, of course, there was always this idea that the Shnumists were not very welcoming of outside scholars, which of course you found not to be the case. I've never found that to be the case either. At least in my sort of relatively informal interactions with people who subscribe to Ilme Shnum. So maybe just tell us a little bit about how you went about the field work and what you think it does for a scholar to actually do that.
So I did my field work when I traveled to India. Mumbai is where I arrived. I stay in Dadar colony a few days, and then if I stay long in Mumbai, I tend to move to Fort area for a few weeks, for a month, 2 months, depending. And then I try often to go, to Gujarat, particularly Udvada, Navsari, Surat, Ahmedabad, if I can, Baroda. But let's say Udvada, Navsari, and Surat are the key cities, the main cities where I go in India, in Gujarat, because there are still 5 temples, Taj Beram, and connection with the priests there. How do I do my field work? I embrace the idea of a slow field work. I don't go there trying to meet the person I'm interested in, having a 2 hours interview, report everything, and then go back and disappear. That's not the way I do my fieldwork. I don't find, it's possible, obviously, to do that, but I don't think you get really the insights. So, for instance, when I meet someone new, and perhaps is someone who I'm interested to speak more, I never take notes. For me, it's not an interview. The first meeting, the second meeting. The first thing is to build trust, to understand what is my interest, what is the interest of the other person in this conversation, in this interaction, and then we start from there. So it's slow field work. It takes time. It takes months to do this. It's not something you can do in a couple of weeks. And the other approach I use is not to speak only with the people who are the protagonists of that specific things. For instance, in the last fieldwork on the Nirangdin, I spoke with the priests who are still performing that ceremony, and I think today there are around 16 who still regularly perform it. But I've also spoken with people who support, for instance, the ceremony, or who criticize this ceremony. They think that is a superstition, you know. So I really try to embrace the broader view. We will never have an objective view of opinions of people, because we cannot run, you know, empirical studies across all the community. But I try to bring in different perspectives, just to make me learn how to look at things in a different way. So this is a bit what I do when I'm in India, and I hope to be back soon. Last time was from February to April of this year, and I hope to be back there soon to meet. You know.
Have you seen a difference between your experiences when you return and people have sort of gotten to know you a little bit, as opposed to when you sort of meet them for the very first time?
What's the difference?
Yeah.
Well, when I go back, for instance, the people who already know me, they are very welcoming. They organize even socials to welcome me, and I can stay to their places in some occasions. They are very helpful in connecting. When I arrive there, my close friends, they know why I'm there, and they open the doors of their network to help to facilitate my research. When I meet new people, so that depends. There's people who is not interested in speaking with scholars. That's normal. I don't see that's not wrong. And while there is other people who may be interested in speaking with scholars to confirm some of their views. You know, understanding if scholarship can support some of the community debates they are in, or this kind of discussions. So obviously the scholar must be always aware of these things before going, and I think you have tackled this in one of your articles, the positionality and the problem of this emic-ethic dialectic between scholars and practitioners. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah.
And when you typically go and you meet someone for the first time, I'm sure you get this question. I mean, I occasionally get this question as well, though sometimes in the reverse way. But people must be curious as to why someone who's Italian wants to come and talk to them about their esoteric views of another religion in another country, right? So how do you sort of, in that sense, self-present what you do and what your aims are from the research perspective?
So you mean what's the reaction when I tell them?
And also, how do you tell them who you are in that sense, and what you're trying to achieve from a scholarly perspective?
Yeah, so, well, first of all, you know, there's a long tradition of Italian scholars in the study of Zoroastrianism. So people who know a bit about scholarship, they associate me with that kind of school, so Carlo Antonio Agnoli, Juan Gosbeck, Nico, Gianfilippo, others. But then I say, no, I never studied there. I was in Mexico doing other stuff, etc. So I think the career shift I did for people may be perceived as an indicator of a deep interest, which goes beyond the idea of finding a job or, you know, doing your job as academic as usual. It's I think it's can show that there's a strong interest behind that. And then as an Italian doing fieldwork in India or studying the Zoroastrian religion, you know, one of the questions that I commonly receive is, do you want to convert to Zoroastrian? Do you want to become a Zoroastrian? And sometimes they think I'm Russian. When there's a bit of anxiety about Russians and Tajiks in India. So, you know, I'm Italian. I don't want to convert. I grew up in Italy. I grew up in Catholic environment and values. I have no interest in converting. I just really want to understand more about this, and I have a genuine fascination for this religion. And when it comes to living Zoroastrians, I must admit that when I sit outside the Fire Temple, for instance, and I know that there are priests practicing, performing a ritual inside, and now the case of the Niragdin is a 19-day ceremony, which implies 9 days of Barashanum, 6 days of the Yasna ceremony, and then the night performance of the Vedida. It's super tiring and it's a huge commitment. So for me, it's an opportunity. You know, I'm really glad I'm there and I can speak with them. I cannot enter into the temple, but they come out and we exchange. I feel lucky, and today there are 16 people doing that. So I think they perceive that my interest is genuine, and it is what it is.
So, what would you say is the sort of central research question or questions that motivate you?
So, well, you know that our field is built on philological work. Philologists established Zoroastrian studies, and still today, I have to say, probably it's the majority of scholars working in this field is philologists, which is great because we have really instruments to engage with primary sources, and it's necessary to really work on this religion. I think one of the key aims for me would be to bring textuality into conversation with living Zoroastrians. So how do you do that? There are many ways. I think, first of all, the Avestan is recited in performance, and performance are still going on. And that's one of the key, connection between text and living Zoroastrians. And there is work, for instance, that Almut is doing on this. Alberto Gantera also is working on ritual and text, on the performativity aspect. I think this is really the way to bring these two things into conversation. The reception of texts, which implies a hermeneutics, interpretation of religion, of text, of rituals. And I look at these things not just as an intellectual work, but as a social practice. When we start reading, texts and how Zoroastrians were using interpretations of their religion in their debates, that goes beyond the understanding of religion into my intimate private sphere or the family. It goes really into, if we see reports of 19th, 20th century, if we read the magazines of that period, these interpretations of religion were really at the center of a strong, fierce debate on Zoroastrianism. So that's why I look at this as a social practice and not only a textual exercise that bring text into the social domain. So I think these are the big things I would like to work by, proposing and conducting several projects. But the idea is to bring textuality into the living Zoroastrianism.
So a little bit of, let's say, methodological consilience between...
Sorry, I cannot hear you.
Can you hear me? Mariano, can you hear me now?
Let me check if there's a problem.
Can you hear me, Mariano? Can the others of you hear me?
Yes, I can still hear.
Okay, great.
Yes.
You can hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Yes, you can. I cannot hear you anymore.
Okay.
Let me drop and enter again.
Sure. So while we're waiting for Mariano to return, I'll just comment about one of the things said in the chat. So Maria Rivetna says that to say the Shunumists are accepting of outsiders is false. And yes, I think there's a slight misunderstanding. All that Mariano and I were saying was that prior to his research, people suggested that the Shunumists would not be interested to talk to scholars from outside the community or people who work on the study of religion from a rationalist perspective. And all we mean is that they were open to having met and discussed and chatted with him. So let's see. And I think Adil says, is Ilmishnum theologically similar to Mormonism? I myself would not say that, but we will allow Mariano to weigh in on this question when he comes in. I think that this is actually a really interesting question. Is Ilmishnum to be understood as a movement, as a sect, or as an alternative to sort of what would typically be understood as sort of orthodox or mainstream Zoroastrianism? And these are always some of the major questions connected with working on individual groups in the study of any religion. And Mariano's dissertation actually addresses all these questions. So once we get him back in, we'll be able to sort of I'll pose this question to him again. So I think he's just coming back in now.
Yes,
Yeah, he's
apologies.
just joined.
Yes.
Apologies. I don't know.
Okay. I can't see you now, but
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I can't see. I don't see. Okay, one second. Hold on. Let me see. Okay, where are you? Oh, there you are. Yes. So,
Apologies for the technical interruption.
great. No worries. Anyway, I just took the opportunity while you were out to sort of briefly answer and sort of contextualize some of the questions that are in the chat. So, no worries. This is a nice moment to maybe make a bit of a transition. So tell me, this is a question that I've asked all the speakers, and it's one of the ones that I particularly like asking. So what is your favorite book or article in the field?
So I think a useful article, as I already mentioned, was an article by you. And then I don't mention this because you are here, but it has really changed the way I looked at the field work and my interaction with Zoroastrians, especially working with modern Zoroastrianism that's necessary. And this no one stands nowhere. Basically, you bring to light the problem of positionality. You propose a solution to overcome this problem, and it inspired me a lot in the field work and also in my thesis. And I would say that also another one which is very useful is I often use it is the Blackwell Companion, because it's really huge and is a first reference for many things associated with Zoroastrianism, and then one can deep dive in other sources, but it's a very good landing place. And I also would like to mention another one which does not belong to Zoroastrian studies, but has been very influential in my studies, and this Bombay Islam by Niall Green, a historian in UCLA. Why it has been so important for me? Because he studied the same city, the same period, 19th century, Bombay, but the community, the Muslim community. So, and he proposed sociological models to bring a different understanding of, to shed light on different aspects of the community, overcoming the problem of Orthodox, Reformers, Liberals, etc. These dichotomies, which I don't like much. And I understand that they are very much used, but then from a scholarly perspective, they are not performative, really, because they don't really tell you who these people is. So I think that book of Niall Green has been really inspiring and influential in my studies.
So I'm very glad to hear that at least 2 out of the 3 I had some small hand in. So that makes me.
Well, the Blackwell is with Michael Strausberg. So.
Yes, of course. Well, a small hand, But no, and I think when Michael Strausberg and I envisioned doing the Wiley Blackwell Companion to Zoroastrianism, which of course now is as a paperback, so it's much more accessible. This was precisely the idea. We wanted it to be a sort of jumping off point for scholars from various aspects of the study of Zoroastrianism to be able to sort of engage with it and get a foothold. And I have to say, you know, one of the things that was a great challenge in constructing the Blackwell was just precisely how so many of the scholars were all philologists, and it was a real challenge to get better quality, a broader amount of material for the study of contemporary Zoroastrianism. And so, you know, someone like yourself entering this field and deciding to focus on real lived people, I think is so important. And I'm very happy to report that we will soon have another companion, the Zoroastrian World, that's being worked on by Jenny Rose, Sarah Stewart, and and I think they have precisely targeted this weakness in the way the field is constructed and the way that our Blackwell work was put together, which is to have more engagement with living people, with not all scholarly approaches, and try to make it a little bit more presentist, which I personally, even though I work on the pre-modern world, I think is just so fundamentally important. So I think let me ask you a slightly different question. So tell us an interesting anecdote from your travels in India, and I think it's a nice opportunity for people to sort of also that's something that you can do as a scholar that, for example, the pre-modernists, we have no anecdotes to have because we don't deal with living people. So,
well, there are. I'll tell you. So, in 2019, I was in Udvada. There was the Utav, which is this huge festival of Zoroastrianism, and I was walking towards the hotel, the Globe Hotel. And on the left, there is this the Pandolya Gyari. And there were the two priests, young priests, Dara and Kobat Barda. They were sitting outside. So, you know, I wanted to meet them. So I entered the precinct and say hi. I introduced myself. And they said some words and then they stopped me. Saying, no. Come in a couple of hours. Okay. So I went to the hotel. And then in the afternoon, I went back. And they told me, okay, now sit on that bench. It was like 20 meters distance. And now we can speak. And I say, why? Because usually I've already met other priests and there's no problem. Why we cannot speak? And they told me, because we took the hub. I said, what is the hub? Is the power of Ahura Mazda to perform. They were doing the Nirangin to perform the ceremony. So, you know, that's why then I proposed a project in Erlangen on the Nirangin, because in that conversation, for the first time, I felt, you know, the materiality of this power, the way they take it. In order to preserve it, they need to keep distance, and there are many rules. And it was, for me, a strange first experience with that kind of, you know, material aspect of power that brought me into the study of Nirangin. And something else that happened, and so you know that as non-Zoroastrian, I cannot enter temple, I cannot observe the ritual performance. So usually when I go, I sit up. If I'm studying a ritual, I sit outside the temple and I speak with people. I see the interactions between different people around the temple. So the ritual is not just 2-3 people. It's 40, 50 people. It's a community effort. There's a sponsor, there's people bringing food in a certain way, prepared in a certain way, material for the alat, barashim wallas, etc. So when I was studying the Nirangin at Wadiaji Atashperam in Mumbai, I think at some point they needed to collect the bull's urine, but there's no Barasiaji in Wadia. So they asked the Kama Agyari to provide their Barasiaji, and they organized the transportation of the Barasiaji from a temple to another. And it took place in the night. for the problem of traffic. And so I was insisting. I said, can I join? It would be like feeling participant of the ritual. And they said, yes, come with us. So I went to the Kama. There was Hormuz Rauji, who is the son of Keki Rauji, the priest in the Tagliari, who organized a group of volunteers, like 6-7 people. I was part of them. There was also Kerman Narwala, and we brought the Varasiaggi from Kama to Waliaggi. It was half an hour, and it was nice to me, to feel part of that. And at some point, so we took 2 breaks on the way to the Waliaggi. At some point, when we took the second break, I think one of the volunteers touched the Varasiaggi in a nice way. Varasiaggi did not like that. And he began turning around, and we were holding the Varasiaggi with ropes. So he was turning the 5 of us all around until Hormuz came and brought peace again. But it was a bit of drama, a bit of panic. These are... For me, it was a privilege to be there and assist to this kind of experience.
It's I think this is something that I feel is one of the great shames of the way that the study of Zoroastrianism has evolved, where these lived experiences that involve certain degree of, let's say, contingency, certain aspects of things not always going as planned, are not as often well understood or appreciated by scholars as when we read a text where essentially we are always able to suggest that there is some perfect system out there that lays out the problem in a kind of very schematic way, where in fact, when we're really dealing with living human beings, that's just not the way that lived traditions operate. And I think there's always been this sense in the study of Zoroastrianism, at least from my perspective, and I think a problematic approach, which is that lived Zoroastrianism was somehow seen as less than the pre-modern Zoroastrianism, as sort of the detritus of an earlier, more pristine system, as something where the lived people knew less. These tropes of sort of decay, of loss, of a sense that somehow we are not what we once were. This is something that Tanya Luhrmann also did when she did her field work. This is something that sort of really came to the fore in that sense. So I was wondering, how much of that have you encountered in your ethnographic work, in your field work, when you talk to people? How much do you have? Is there this sense of sort of some sense of loss, or a sense that we are not what we once were?
Well, I call it the nostalgia of the past, and it's really present, and it is not only in people, actually. I don't think it's a... there are also Parsis, for instance, in India, who really think, that was superstition, irrational, now we do other things, and they don't care much. So again, I would always be careful to homogenizing a community. There are few voices, different voices, etc. But what your question brought to my mind is when I started the first days of fieldwork in Fort, I like to walk in the morning. I go out, cutting chai, walk in the streets, and Fort is built by Parsis, and you see names of Zoroastrian things everywhere, or the buildings, Persepolis styles, temples, etc. Also, in the materiality, you see this nostalgia, because there are these rusty things. Some buildings are a bit, you see the shade of the past on that, perhaps not very much well preserved. And that inspired me to work on aesthetics, on both sides. As an ethnographer, working on my body, as a way to access senses, and the experience of the past in southern Mumbai, and also, aesthetics in ritual performance. But I think this nostalgia of the past is very strong, is there. And it also, at least in my studies, when one goes back to the 18th, 19th, 20th century, it's not only a Zoroastrian thing. I connect it with the revivalist nationalism that was spread across the Persian world from Iran to India from the 19th century onwards. And this nationalism was portraying the glorious pre-Islamic past in opposition to the contemporary decay of the Arab ruler. So it's not new. And the Parsis are not the only one having this kind of nostalgia of the past. So I try always to contextualize this broadly, but it's there. I think it is a very good point, the one you made.
I think it's an very important point that that you just made. And I think it's something that I think also the field of the study of Zoroastrianism has struggled with. It's this idea of always trying to look at Zoroastrianism as something exceptional. And insofar as doing that, I think we have often lost the broader context. And just as you mentioned, Niall Green's book, you can see so many social processes existing in either Gujarat or in India or in Tehran or in, let's say, North America, which are shared by other communities. And, especially minority communities. And so I think this is something that I think is often lost on both the scholars and the community. The scholars often have this issue because of how we're trained, because to really be able to do something interesting in the study of Zoroastrianism, you need to know a lot of things about the pre-modern Zoroastrian world. Otherwise, the contemporary or the early modern doesn't make sense. At the same time, that's so complex and so fragmentary in some particular aspects that you often land up in a scenario where people have a kind of very Zoroastrian view of things rather than sort of the broader perspective. And I think that's something that I've always appreciated in reading your work, is that you really made a very concerted effort to historicize sort of the people you were writing about in their moment. And I think that's something that is so valuable for the study of a small community of living people like we are today, because when you capture people in their moment, you can see certain things that you wouldn't if you were just looking at them from a very kind of schematic perspective and judging them by sort of the views of the past. And I think that's something that I always feel has been often left out a little bit in the study of Zoroastrianism. Even some of the great ethnographic work of the past, Mary Boyce in Iran in the 60s and such, was still always trying to contextualize it vis-a-vis the ancient past. So this sort of leads me to my next question. So what's the coolest or most surprising thing about Zoroastrianism that you have read or experienced in your studies and your research?
There are, well, a few things. For instance, going back to the positionality, as an Italian who grew up, in I'm a bad Catholic, but in my town there were when I was a child, I was going to church, etc. When I read the first time the attacks of John Wilson on the community, I could not believe that it was really mean. So that was one of the first surprises. I could never expect a priest to say these things about other people. It was quite violent, I must say. That was a surprise. And if I go into perhaps my ethnography, something that really was surprising in my last work on the Nirangdin. So it's a very long ceremony, very difficult, one of the questions I made to the performers was, what is the most difficult moment of the performance of the 19 days? Now you tell me, I make you a question. What would have been the answer? What do you think the answer was?
You're asking me. Perhaps just something like fatigue towards the end.
Fatigue, the last day, when did that is 7 hours without interruption, the barrack room in isolation. No, and this is quite a consistent answer among all the performers. The most difficult moment is collecting the urine from the bull. I said, why? You just put a bucket? Yeah, you just put a bucket, but you can be there half an hour or 8 hours. So it's really unpredictable. So the uncertainty of the ritual, I mean, you can really decide all the rules, the rule following of every aspects of the ritual, but there is always a degree of uncertainty that makes the ritual a social practice, which is worth still practicing nowadays, because ritual is a way to control uncertainty. And the priests today find very annoying that when they need to wait 4, 5, 6 hours for the bull to urine, and then they are very tired. It increases, it's a workload of fatigue, and so this was very surprising. I was not expecting this kind of answer, and it's still here in my mind that we read about this.
Yeah, and again, that's another wonderful example of how this sort of quotidian, daily aspect of lived religion captures something so important about how people engage with their religious tradition. And I think this is where one of the great aspects, one of the challenges of working on pre-modern Zoroastrianism, as I do, is how do you find a way to sort of extract from the texts that sort of daily, almost seemingly mundane aspect of what it means to be a Zoroastrian. Whether it's a priest, whether it's someone going to a fire temple, whether it's someone, or even from my perspective, even someone who maybe considers themselves a-religious or has, I mean, even in that sense, there are these modalities to how they are present in the world in that sense. And so let me turn around and sort of pose to you another question. So we need to sort of wind this down. So I want to just get the last couple of questions in there before we can turn to some Q&A. So what, in your opinion, is the future of Zoroastrian, both textual studies, but I'm actually more interested in your view on what you think the future looks like for the study of lived religion, field work, ethnography for Zoroastrianism?
So, as I mentioned before, textuality, living Zoroastrianism need to go together. I think is important for future ethnographers still to take training on languages. Now, you don't need to become a philologist, but you need to be aware of the key religious concept, when they come from, why text is so important. Still today, Avesta is a performative language. So if you want to work with the religion of Zoroastrians, you need to know a bit of languages. So that's one thing. I think Cantera and Almut also, they are showing a bit the way on how to do that with digital humanities. That's very interesting as well. I think when it comes to pure ethnography, as I mentioned earlier, I'm very interested in aesthetics. Sound, obviously, the performance of the language, smell. So again, with Nirangdin, there's a point in the video that when they throw pebbles into these buckets of water and urine.
Right.
And what they told me is that the sound, you are at the peak of the ecstasy of, performance of the ritual, that sound, that splash, it's like the power of Aura Mazda that transform, consecrate bulls and urine. That's a beautiful example of how aesthetics can be really a data using a dry word to really disentangle some aspects of the performance. Another one is smell. So, for instance, a priest from Surat told me that after having performed the Nirangdin, by smelling the Nirang, he understands if the performance was successful or not, because it told me that it can perceive change of smell. So there are all these aspects, the sounds of the bells and many things that, on the one hand, being outside of the temple, one cannot grasp because you are not there. But there are also aesthetics happening outside. For instance, lay people, after a yasna is performed, in the pavi, the two priests finish, there is a bit of homnipani, the home juice, which is left. And lay people can enter and take a bit and sip. And I could see that, people entering and then coming back and telling me why they're doing that. Or after the Nirangdin, they come with the duro, this thread, which is tied alongside the buckets. And again, I think aesthetics is very important, is underlooked, overlooked. And for that, I was also very much inspired by one of the key anthropologists working on aesthetics, Paul Stoller and others, Conor Casey, for instance, with whom I worked together in Germany when I was in Erlangen. So I saw how they brought to light really fascinating histories by working on aesthetics, and it's also a way to reach wider audience, not just scholars. And then you were making a question. Yeah, the last thing I think it's important to work is hermeneutics. So you work on hermeneutics. There's work done on Middle Persian, on Pahlavi, but when it comes to Persian and Gujarati especially, there's not much. And that was a challenge for me when I engaged with primary sources in Gujarati, because there's no reference. And there are thousands of texts in Gujarati, which is, I consider the hermeneutical jar of modern Zoroastrians. Absolutely. So I think working on that in continuity with Pahlavi, Persian, and Gujarati, this is a body which really needs to be worked on. Hermeneutics also in contemporary perspective that liaises again with the social practice.
Yeah, and I think this is something that I've been saying till I was blue in the face, is that Gujarati, for example, is probably the largest corpus of Zoroastrian literature that we have, and yet it's almost not studied by scholars in any meaningful way. And I think the challenge always with the modern material is that someone says, oh, well, in order to really make sense of the Gujarati that's being done, I would need to know Persian, and I would need to know some Arabic, and I would need to know Pahlavi, and I would need to know Avestan. And so we kind of, we always have that sort of, that issue. So I think we should probably wind down. So I will just ask you two very, very quick questions. What is a project that you would like to work on in the future? And the second question is, how can we grow the field and make it more accessible to living Zoroastrians?
Okay, I have many projects in the mind. So selecting one that I did not mention yet, I think the relational role of priests is something I would like to work on, especially from a global perspective. The role is changing in the US, in Canada, in London, in Iran, in India, and understanding how priests as parent, as partner, as community leader, as performer, as a scholar, they connect with the community and how the role is changing. And that's a way for me to really bring to light different ontologies, different modes of existence of the same religions, practitioners, but in different contexts. Then the other question was,
how can we grow the field and make the field of Zoroastrian studies and make it more accessible to living?
So grow the field, I think we need to apply for grants. I feel blessed because Almut is a super grant writer, and I think next year I will start writing a grant, and I hope to get her mentorship on that. Then I think we need to teach theory to our students. It's important to go beyond the Zoroastrian field and start making contributions to disciplines and to area studies in a broader way. That's the way to bring Zoroastrianism up into academia, I think.
I agree.
Working on intersection with other religions, with Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, etc. I mean, there are Jaina. We can really work on the Ismailis. You know, these are all greenfield, and it's a potentiality to work with other area studies, other colleagues, expand a bit the field. And I think also to make it more accessible, we need to innovate a bit the teaching. For instance, here in London, we run an institute, we run a summer school every year. And often we have people who just come because of an interest, and it's 1 week, and it's not just for scholars. Then we have an online program as well. Almut is doing a priestly training with Ramya Karanja. So I think finding innovative way to reach the community, to make it more accessible, that's important. That does not need to be a 2-year master program. You know, we can really think of different ways. And now with new technologies, you know, it's easy to reach out as you are doing with these wonderful Vevaina conversations. This is one of the ways, indeed.
Well, you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly the idea, right? I think it's really useful for people in the community to see that there are people engaged, passionate people like yourself working who have a lot to contribute. And, you know, my personal hope has always been that something like one of these conversations gets some younger Zoroastrians interested to come and do the same things that we do, because the material is just fascinating. There's so much amazing stuff. So I think let's sort of turn around and let's perhaps look at some of the questions in the chat. Tanya, do you want to curate them? Do you want to?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to. I'll just kind of go up from where I last saw it. This one was for Professor Mariano. One of the questions asking if you've ever talked to Parsi children of interfaith marriages, and if so, what have you learned from them? That's one part of the question, so maybe we'll start there.
So you talk to Parsi children of interfaith marriages? So
Yes.
So I have, yes, I spoke with a few of them. Not children, they are grown up now. I don't work with children, but the adults that are children of interfaith marriages. What I learned from them. So I think at some point I had a conversation with Shernaz Kama, if I'm not wrong. She was doing some work with the children of interfaith marriages. And based on quantitative analysis, showing that, you know, some of the ideas we have on the transmission of religion may be wrong in some cases. That, you know, the mother is the one transmitting the religion. That could be bias. We don't know, and that's not always the case. Many times, especially in today's time, religion is a choice. There's a strong individual agency, the freedom of choosing. So I think what I learned from them is exactly that. But we have many biases in the way the religion is transmitted, and there's no standard way that we can really trace and make official or formalize. Then there was another question from.
Yeah, there was a second part of that question, which is if you visited the fire temple in Pune, which is open to interfaith Parsis, and if you've talked to Mr. Wadia over there, and if there's anything you've learned from his experience or from Parsis who've attended that temple.
So I was planning to go in early 2020, but then COVID came, I think. And Pune was one of my, also this temple. I know about this temple, but I could not go. And in my recent fieldwork, I had no chance to go to Pune, but I have plans to go, and I had no chance to talk with Mr. Wadia, unfortunately. So I'm sorry, I'm not useful here.
All right, great. This is a question for both of you. It's saying if there's a reason your research work Is there a reason that your research work on the esoteric remains esoteric when published? And if you're planning to make it a bit more simpler, maybe more in layman's terms, and then keep scholarly work for the nerds, is what they've written here.
So it's for both. I start.
It's for, yeah, you can start, Mariano.
So, yeah, no, the idea where esoteric itself is very difficult concept. I'm trying to make the case for a Zoroastrian esotericism that it exists, is there. Scholars of religions don't really engage with that. The idea, I think, is to. So now, yesterday, I submitted my book, which is my thesis revised for a book.
Congratulations.
And thank you. And I think one of the main point is to make it accessible. Otherwise, doesn't make sense to a bigger audience. And you do that by really explaining well the concept you are using, zooming in, zooming out, reflecting on that, not just given, having assumptions that many of these scholarly ideas, concepts, and buzzwords are understand in the same way by all the people. So you really need to be careful in explaining well all the concepts, ideas, terms you use, and be sure that they can be read by a broader audience. Now you will tell me if I failed or not once the book is published. So I hope you will keep in touch.
I think having read Mariano's thesis myself quite closely, I can say that Mariano is a generally very accessible writer, and I think this is something that is it's always a tension for us as scholars, because we are scholars. We primarily publish in scholarly venues. As a result, the work will be technical. It needs to be, otherwise we wouldn't be taken seriously by our colleagues in other fields. At the same time, there's a great hunger from living Zoroastrian communities to have more accessible works. Having said that, I have several people who are on this chat who have said to me privately, I've read the introductory works that exist. They're great. Now I want the next level up, but the next level up suddenly gets ultra technical. So this is always a bit of the challenge when you're dealing with a small field, in terms of demography, not in terms of material. I mean, I think this is something that we always say this is a small field, but in fact, the study of Zoroastrianism is one of the rare traditions that has a lived component and stretches back 3,500 plus years. So we have a lot of area and time period to traverse, but we don't always have a lot of, let's say, pardon the gendered language, but we don't have a lot of manpower. So this is something that has resulted in some slightly distortions in the sense that, say, the early modern period is not as well studied as it needs to be. As we said, Gujarati, I mean, you can't even find one really scholarly work that looks at a single important Gujarati text. So that's a bit unusual. I mean, of course, the Parsi priests, the Parsi scholar priests published many of those things in Gujarati in the late 19th and early 20th century. But since then, we don't have a kind of a follow-up to that. And I think also, esotericism, and here maybe I'll jump in for a second and speak on Mariano's behalf. Esotericism is a difficult topic to write about, because in many ways it's a reaction to, and it's in dialogue with sort of non-esoteric, more, let's say, mainstream approaches to religion, which forces you to, in a way, try to get at the heart of the question, is like, what is religion and what is religious experience? That's really difficult to do in, let's call it, plain natural language. I mean, you almost need a whole set of critical idioms and concepts to really, unpack that. So that's always a bit, I think, a little bit of a challenge with that question. So can we perhaps Tanya, next one maybe?
Definitely. There's another question. This is specifically for Mariano. It says that your Italian background reminds one of other Italian scholars who've also studied Zoroastrianism. They've listed Noli, Pedazzoni, Gozano, and others. Have their writings left any impressions on you and your work?
Italian scholars, yeah, obviously I read Noli. He has been probably the founder of the field, in a leading figure in Italy, and actually interacting with Carlo Cereti, with Antonio Panaino, who were students of Noli, is interesting also to see how his teachings landed into them and what they agree or disagree. Recently, there was a seminar on the figure and historicity of Zarathustra, and I think one of the readings I gave to the students was a passage from Noli's book about Zarathustra. How he was dating, I don't remember well which passage, but if I'm not wrong, is how I was, which technique he was using to date Zarathustra back to the, 3rd century. I don't remember. But I think, for instance, recent in production from Italian scholarship, the book of Domenico Agostini with Trope on Buddhism, it's very interesting and useful because it was very much needed. The Buddhism, besides being very important for the field of Zoroastrian studies, it's really, a important book on cosmology that goes beyond our field and is important for scholars of other fields, for instance. That's why I think it has been successful, as well as reading on Apocalyptic, and Antonio Panaino has worked and written a lot on esotericism in himself, ritual performance. So I think, yes, I'm in awe of the production of Italian scholars, and I learn a lot from them.
If I can jump in here, Mariano and Dan Sheffield and myself are co-editing a special issue of a journal specifically on the question of esotericism and Zoroastrianism, and we've tried very hard to get submissions that represent different sides of Zoroastrian esotericism, not just what one might see with Parsis in India, but also looking at questions connected with various groups who engage with Zoroastrianism from the outside, whether it be, let's say, I think we have one on Zoroastrianism and heavy metal music, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So I think, and the reason we wanted to do this is we really have this view that we want to be as open-minded as possible to look at how the repertoire of symbols that makes up what we would call Zoroastrianism can be deployed and engaged with by various groups and communities and individuals. And I think this is always, another one of the challenges that we face when we work on living Zoroastrianism is you get some really interesting cultural outputs, and then our scholars sort of who know us and from related fields say, oh, that's really interesting, but that's really just the idea of one person, whereas, and so, we're not necessarily going to have giant scale when we're looking at the questions connected with living Zoroastrianism. We're always looking ultimately at relatively small numbers by the standards of, let's say, Islam or, let's say, Christianity. And I think that's just, that aspect is both a challenge but also an opportunity for us. And this is why I like Mariano's approach to the study of Zoroastrianism, is that he takes a fundamentally qualitative approach. It's not trying to sort of just fit Zoroastrianism into some box that exists somewhere, of some category developed in another discipline or another field of study.
Yeah, that's complex with all these categories, the imperialism of categories.
Precisely. And I think this is something that I think also, to go back to an earlier question about why our work feels esoteric to community members. When we work on a topic as a scholar, we have to engage with not just what's happening in the cultural and knowledge production of the Zoroastrian group or text or person we're looking at, but we also have to put that into dialogue with the scholarly, conceptual literature that has been produced on that topic by other people in other disciplines. So, for example, when Mariano mentions, contingency in the study of ritual, there's literature on this and has to be engaged with in that way. And then all of a sudden, it just seems a little bit abstract for community members, and that's sort of the challenge of this.
Do you both have time for like maybe one or two more questions?
I can,
Yeah.
sure.
Okay. There was a theological question here. So this question open to you both. It says, is Il-Kushnum theologically similar to Mormonism?
I did not study Mormonism. I know a few things. I don't think so. I'm not sure. So Il-Kushnum has been, there's not much research on Il-Kushnum. That's why I did it. And what I've read before starting doing research on Il-Kushnum was that it was a reworking of theosophical ideas. When engaging with the primary sources, with Gujarati texts, I found that many of the concepts and ideas do not come from theosophy, but they rather come from the Persianate areas, from Iran, and they may be also very ancient. They come from a religious diversity of the area. So there is obviously some language which is similar to that of theosophists. Why? Because it was the language used by 19th, 20th century practitioners of esoteric things in Europe and throughout the networks of the colony. But more than this, I don't know about Mormonism. If theology is similar or not, you caught me in a weakness.
Yeah, I partially answered this question when you were logging back in, and I also don't think that it really I don't think it necessarily shares anything in a major way with Mormonism. I would say, of course, that all these religions that develop in the 19th sort of, in the sort of 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries, and giving it a slightly broader period to call them sort of early modern and modern religions, they do share, of course, certain structural properties in common. And I think, there is, and so in that sense, they may feel that they share certain resonances, and I think that is to be expected when you're trying to historicize the origins and development of a particular religion or a particular sort of let's say movement within a religion. And I think one thing that I've always found very interesting, and I think this is something that I've really enjoyed reading in Mariano's dissertation, and I would really enjoy reading in the book, is the kind of the really vexed question of what does it mean to be modern? What does it mean to be modern as a person in the world, and what does it mean to be modern as a Zoroastrian in the world? Because so much of contemporary Zoroastrianism and modern and Zoroastrian identity is connected with this question of modernity. So, it's obviously too complicated to go into here. He works on and writes about some of this, but I think that's the aspect that I find quite fascinating in the work that Mariano engages with and the approaches that he takes to this. So.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you so much. There's lots of amazing compliments in the chat box for this session, which I think just helps us bring it to its natural conclusion. So thank you so much, Johan. Thank you, Mariano, for this really interesting and insightful discussion. I appreciate both of you giving your time today for Zoroastrian Conversations, and looking for many more. And hopefully we'll see you both actually at the North American Congress that's happening next year. Thank you, everybody, for attending today. Sorry, go ahead, Johan, if you have any last words.
I just want to read one comment from Adil, which I think is quite interesting. Sure. It says, the story of how the ideas were found are pretty similar. I lived in Utah for 2 years and I've been to the Pandol Temple many times, worthy of an exploration if interested. I'd nerd out with you on it. Mariano, this is actually quite, the idea of how the knowledge came down to these founders. In that sense, I now see the way that it's worded. I do understand.
Mormonism.
Yes, I think there is something very interesting here. And I think you should follow up with Adil and chat with him at some point.
It's a line of inquiry, yeah.
Yes, and I think that it captures something. I think it wouldn't surprise me if there were certain things in common also with the Baha'i as well. This. So I think there is something here,
Well, I hope we do not lose these comments. And I think there's a way to save them, right? In Zoom, probably.
Yes, we definitely can. And we'll make sure that the recording of the session is on YouTube for anyone who missed it so they can watch. If you both have like 10 minutes of your time, what I can do is after we end the session, anyone who wants to unmute themselves can ask any questions that might have not been asked. And then we'll conclude from there. So thank everybody for attending today. If you do have any questions, I'm just going to give you the chance to unmute yourselves now and you may ask right away. All right. So everyone should have the opportunity now to unmute and ask any questions they have.
Johan and Mariana, first, this is Nauza. Thanks, a great show. Quick question, there's always this thought about modernism, and yet I think there is a lack of practical information on what it means to be a Zoroastrian. How do you live your life? Is there some kind of a cheat sheet that you could put out there, for people to follow? What does it mean to be a Zoroastrian, and how do you live that life today?
That's a difficult question.
Well, okay, given my positionality, I'll take this question. I don't think that, bluntly speaking, I don't think you can cheat sheet a tradition. I think you can have a sort of small little spiel that you tell different types of people about who you are and what you believe, depending on context. If I meet someone in a cocktail party and I have 2 minutes, I'll do something different than if I have 5 minutes. But I don't think that, I think the idea that you can cheat sheet 3,500 years of history doesn't really work. I mean, you can reduce it to some very basic elements of which there's a great amount of dispute, both by scholars and living members. So trying to figure out what you share in common would be hard. I mean, I've thought about this question a lot because people have asked me these kinds of questions. So I'm willing to say, I've thought about it a lot actually, and I'm willing to say that if there is something that I find consistently sort of re-engaged with in some form from the very beginning of Zoroastrianism to you today, I think you could say that something like the Good Thoughts, Words and Deeds Credo works that way. But what that means is and what Good Thoughts, Words and Deeds mean would be culturally contextual, in that a priest in Kerman in the 9th century, in the early years of Islam, may have a very different idea than his predecessor at the end of the Sasanian period, just to use 2 little examples like that. So I think, meaning is something that we derive from a repertoire of symbols and practices that we often land up calling something like a religion or a philosophy or a tradition or whatever term we're using in the particular moment. And I think that's why I feel like why I really enjoy Mariano's approach to the study of religion, because he's always trying to make sure that meaning for the individuals who are experiencing the particular religious moment or tradition is the important aspect. It's not trying to make Zoroastrianism into some structural property that has that that you have to go and say, does it fit this set of sort of pre-existent criteria? Mariano, would you like to sort of?
Yeah, I think, I mean, what I find is polyphony. So making a guide of what the Zoroastrian is difficult because there's no one Zoroastrian similar to the other. You know, Parsis, for instance, in India, they say one Parsi, one religion, two Parsis, two religions. There is a high degree of subjectivation of individuality in the practice of the religion.
I would say that, you know, the joke that I always hear from my Parsi life is that you get 5 Parsis in a room and you're going to get 6 opinions, you know? So I think it's worth, I think it's worth always keeping that in mind. And I think that's always also the challenge of the study of Zoroastrianism, is that individual people's voices get louder than they would in the study of much bigger scale, demographically larger religions. You could talk about, you know, Christianity in Africa. It's harder to do that with the study of Zoroastrianism. Like if you looked at John Hinnell's work, his global work on Zoroastrianism, yes, he's talking about areas, whether it's Hong Kong or it's, you know, Toronto or something like that. But when you really look closely, it's actually about the people there, because he can do it at that scale, the way that, you know, for example, in a bigger tradition, you in fact cannot. So there is an advantage to the lack of scale that at least contemporary Zoroastrianism has in this particular moment.
I see there is a question in the chat, which is interesting, about West Africa. So I heard you mention West Africa. Did you study the Orisha and Yoruba culture as practiced in Nigeria? So if I can briefly answer this, I did not, but I have an interesting thing to share. So when I was in Germany, one of my colleagues, a professor of anthropology from Rochester, New York, she has worked 20 years in Nigeria, and she told me about the Maguzawa. I don't know if someone has already heard about this. It's a group, it's in Hausa language, Maguzawa means Magi, and it's a group of traders that from sub-Sahara to North Nigeria, they were trading, and there are reports of meat, some practices which are similar to Zoroastrianism to some extent. And we are putting together a project to investigate more about this. And I also need to thank the community in London. I saw that Rosita Lally is connected. You know, here in London, we have the diaspora from Africa, basically. And they have been quite important for me to understand more about the presence in Africa. In Nigeria, it was not a huge settlement of Parsis, but there were a few families. There are still a few families there. Because from East Africa, the Parsis were administrating the railway, so they reached Nigeria as well. And that's, you know, when I saw the question on West Africa, it's something that I forgot to mention earlier.
I think it's also worth saying that in historical terms, when you see words connected with Majus and Magi and such, they take on a life of their own. So, for example, you see references to the Magi, the Majus and things in Islamic sources on Scandinavia. But that doesn't actually mean the Magi in the Zoroastrian sense of the term. It's largely a term that has now come to mean foreign, esoteric religion associated with magical practices, let's say. So I think that's also something worth keeping in mind, that we have to be a little bit disciplined about trying to look at these questions and not make it one size fits all. I mean, I think Mariano's example and what he's talking about is something interesting. It is something unusual, but in the earlier material, it's often comes to mean just a kind of a cover term for, you know, like literally the way we would use the term today, magician, you know?
That's the question, is how they were creating categories. That's the question to answer.
Exactly. I think Adil has a hand.
Adil, if you can unmute yourself, if you're able to.
Yeah, I can do it. I put my question in the chat, but essentially, the question is, the community identifies itself as Zoroastrian today. However, historically it identified itself as Mazdayasni. Like, the question of what Mazdayasni is not the question here, but like, when did that transition from like being Mazdayasni to being Zoroastrian happen? In the sense that, like, being a community that identifies as a worshiper of a concept to like a worshiper of a prophet. Like, or is that linguistically, am I being semantic on that? I don't know.
Do you want me to take this?
Yes,
Yes, yes,
whoever.
please.
So, yes, you are being semantic, but there is a historical aspect here. So, in the Avestan material, you get both terms, Mazdayasni, Zarathushri. Mazda Yasni means worshipper, sacrificer to Mazda, Ahura Mazda. Zarathushri means follower of Zarathustra. I don't think that they're highly, I think they are in one form or the other what we would call now today, by our definition, Zoroastrian. I don't think there's any difference. I don't think it's any great, I don't think that there's some, for me, I don't see any pre-Zoroastrian following of Ahura Mazda not connected with Zarathustra. I think it's all the same. The Pahlavi sources almost always say Mazde Snan, which is the Pahlavi form of Mazda Yasni. And that means what we would just translate that as Zoroastrianism. The use of the term Zoroastrianism with Zarathustra and the religion now being, following the prophet, so to speak, in its self-identification, is something that we see that starts happening in the sort of the medieval Persianate context. And again, I don't think it's highly meaningful, in the sense that I don't think we're not talking about two religions. We're just talking about the same thing using different terminology. So from my perspective, the community switch can be dated to what we would see in classical Persian, because in Pahlavi they still used Mazde Snan. The Pahlavi once in a very rare while will say something like Zardushtian or something like that, but that's extremely, for Zoroastrians in that sense, but that's extremely, extremely, very, very rare. So I think, there've always been this idea that there was this, like, what was Iranian religion before Zarathustra, right? But that's a different question. I think, it's not one that can really be answered, because the sources as we have them in Avestan use both terms, Mazda Yasni and Zarathushtri. Does that answer the question for you?
Yes.
Good. So
We're going to have a question from Geeta. Geeta, if you want to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone, my dear teachers, and I'm so blessed to be here among these great teachers, great teachings, and I can be more thankful. And how did I get there? Don't ask me that question. But I have a question from the professor, and I'd be grateful to receive an answer from him. He said there was the Judaism and Christianity and Islam and Zoroastrians, we just dump them all together. We're just making them one religion, and we'll just follow one goal, and he's interested. And you, if I'm not mistaken, you're interested in researching of how we pray, what we should pray, if we should pray or not. You do your research, and that's what you're interested, if I am not mistaken. So the question that I have, how can you become a Zoroastrian? It's not easy. It's not, we don't have books. We have humanity. We have good thoughts, good words, good deed, and to become a Zoroastrian, I mean, they all want to be our friends, but being actually a Zoroastrian, to be my friend Nirvana, or to be my other friend Delbar, it's not easy. It's difficult. And my question is to you is, how can you become a Zoroastrian? Thank you. If you're not already are.
Mariano?
That's a difficult question. Again, well, given your positionality, how do you become a Zoroastrian?
Yeah, so, this is a question that I think is also, we always talk about historicizing our sources. And I think it's also worth saying that we are also, in a sense, when we work with living people, we have to sort of historicize their particular questions, concerns, and the discourse and style of discourse that they deploy. So the short answer to your question is, when we look at the broad history of Zoroastrianism, there are large moments where this question was essentially a meaningless question, because the people who were talking to themselves were all Zoroastrians. This question only sort of comes into vogue to some extent when there was a need for it. So we can see the engagement with this question in the late Pahlavi texts, when you have the minoritization of Zoroastrians in the early Islamic era, and you start to have the question, and this becomes a real question, like, who is a Zoroastrian? What does it mean to be Zoroastrian? So we have we get in the Pahlavi legal literature, we see things like, my Muslim slave boy wants to be Zoroastrian. How does he do so? Things like that, questions like that, which were never posed before, because the material was dealing with different things. And I think that's really important to realize, that when we talk about the pre-modern period, we have texts produced by people that serve certain pragmatic purposes. So, if I find, and I'm just using a ridiculous example just to make the point, if archaeologists hundreds of years from now, excavated my parents' house, and they found the operating manual for the blender, and they go and look for religious meaning there, they'll find it. But it's worth saying that the operating manual for the blender focuses on what that particular textual function was. So religious texts don't always deal with the questions that we want answered in that sense. Now, once we get to the modern period, and once we have the output of living people, then it's a different question, because we start to see various different approaches. We start to see this question being posed, whether it's being posed in the early 20th century in the courts, by the famous case with the Tatars and the Parsi Panchayat. The question is sort of being posed there. That's in a legal framework. And then from that point on, we see this question posed increasingly in different contexts. And I think it's worth saying that you're going to get very different approaches to answering this question. There will be certain people who will say that, in order to be a Zoroastrian, you have to have two Zoroastrian parents. There are other people who say Zoroastrianism is not a religion at all. It's just a philosophy, or, so you're going to get very different answers. I will give you an interesting kind of counter example to this, which I think is something worth saying, that if you were to ask most Muslims today in the world, billion plus people, what does it mean how do you become Muslim? they'll give you a set of answers, and they're all relatively historically well grounded in some form or the other. If you're asking people who have some knowledge of things. But when we actually look at, for example, Al-Tabari, one of the great early Islamic historians, when he talks about what it means to be Muslim, and I'm using that as an example just to take it away from the Zoroastrian thing for a second, he says to be Muslim is to pray in a particular direction and to slaughter meat in a particular way, in the way that we do. I would be very surprised if the slaughtering of meat is something that any living Muslim would say is the very primary definition of the religion. But in a sense, what Tabari is actually telling us is it's about practice. That's what he's describing. And if we put it into a conceptual category, it's about lived practice. And that's, I think, where the way that Mariano operates and what Mariano works on is so useful and important for the study of Zoroastrianism, because it's about capturing what does it mean to make meaning from practice, rather than sort of look and say there is some notion of this ism out in the world somewhere in the metaphysical space of which I know and you don't know, or you know and I don't know, or whatever the case is.
Mm-hmm. So, if I can add on that, so going back to research on Ilmak Shnum, Parsis following this knowledge, they are quite ethnocentric, so they do not like conversions. However, they say that at the end of times, when Shah Bahram Marzavan will come, he will decide. He can convert everybody, And what is interesting is that one of the persons who follows the teaching of the Shashrof Ilmak Shnum, Meher Mastermus, she claims to be in contact with Shah Bahram Marzavan, and in the last decades has been, favoring some conversions of Russian and Tajikis into Zoroastrian with the Najot and this kind of rituals. So these also, to me, exemplify how the same small group of people have two opposed views on the same problem. And this degree of subjectivity, this degree of diversity, which is really to me, is the measure of the community to some extent.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I think, if you talk to Iranian Zoroastrians, conversion is a big issue. If you talk to Parsis, intermarriage is a big issue. So you really see that the social conditions, the political conditions of the area influence the way that the particular set of the preoccupations that the groups have. North America, of course, is a blended place. And so, in fact, North America is interesting because in some ways you get both of those happening. Whereas, for example, in the UK, where Mariano and I are based, the questions are a little bit different. I mean, because they reflect a different sort of social and historical reality. And, I think we should end now, but there's one last that Artemis writes. She says, I wonder how many centers in North America practice and perform the rituals that many scholars study and write about. Are these rituals widely performed and practiced among most Zoroastrians in North America? I think it's really important to recognize that when we're talking about rituals, most of us who are scholars, we're talking about rituals that we know of from the pre-modern period. Every single thing written in the pre-modern period virtually was made by and written by priests. So we are studying to a large extent the priestly knowledge production of the past. So living priests are relatively, given the time span and changes and all of those things, are relatively speaking faithful, I would say, to the practices and such of the pre-modern material. But by definition of how it has come down to us, living non-priestly Zoroastrian quotidian practices, daily practices of a typical normal person, whether it's in Iran or India or North America, that's never going to find a good analog or sort of predecessor in the past, because while we get glimpses of that, it's relatively muted, because that's not really what the Zoroastrian textuality was doing. We only get it in certain types of texts, like in Pahlavi literature, where they ask questions, where a layperson will ask a priest a question connected with something with daily life, like, or we sometimes get it in the medieval Persian literature and the Rivayat literature, the letters between the Iranian priests and the Parsis, where they say, the Parsis will say, "Can we cook with ghee?" And the Iranians are like, "No," or it shows you the acculturation to Indian culinary sort of practices. Or, "Can we wear lungi?" "No, you must wear trousers," things like that. Those are like nice examples of where we can see sort of daily aspects. But that's always the challenge with this material. And also, to sort of close the circle, the question of what is esoteric in pre-modern Zoroastrianism is a very hard one for us to answer, because we almost have to work out what is not esoteric in order to contrast it. And that is something that we don't know how to do. So it's, in that sense, I think we are in the very early stages of being able to make our texts meaningful in their particular moment that they were produced, or whether it's texts, or in the case of Mariano, with living people. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody. I think we had a really long and very insightful discussion. Really appreciate everyone's incredible questions. Thank you, Johan and Mariano, for your time and for your thoughtful answers. If anyone wants to get in touch with you both, if their questions weren't answered, is there a way they can, whether it's email, online, social media? Can you let us know?
Yeah, email works. Email works for me. I'm also on Facebook, so you can do it that way as well, though I don't tend to I use Facebook sort of sporadically.
I will
What's
put
your-
my email in the chat.
Yes, please. If you both don't mind, just adding your emails, and then people can take note of that if they want to reach out to you. Because I know many more of you had more questions. Unfortunately, we just won't have time to get around to it. Thank you again, Johan. Thank you so much, Mariano, for your time today. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And hopefully we'll see you more for our future Zoroastrian conversation sessions. Thank you, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you for organizing, Tanya.
And
course.
Thank you.
especially
It was
thank you,
wonderful.
Mariano.